The snow fell thick and heavy on the auction platform in Reno, Nevada, where Xavier Oakley stood among a crowd of rough men who reeked of whiskey and bad intentions, watching as a young woman was dragged forward onto the wooden stage by a merchant who called himself a businessman, but was nothing more than a slave trader operating in the shadows of respectable society. It was January of 1878, and the bitter cold had driven most decent folk indoors, leaving only the desperate and the cruel to conduct their business in the dying light of afternoon. Xavier had ridden into Reno 3 days prior, his packhorse laden with furs from a winter trapping season spent alone in the Sierra Nevada mountains. At 32 years old, he had grown accustomed to solitude, preferring the company of pine trees and rushing streams to the corruption of civilization. His plan had been simple: sell his furs, purchase supplies, and return to his cabin before the worst of winter set in. But as he passed through the alley behind the Silver Dollar Saloon, he heard the announcement that stopped him cold. Fresh stock, young and healthy, perfect for cooking, cleaning, and warming your bed. Xavier's stomach turned, but something compelled him forward. He told himself he was merely curious about how low humanity could sink, but deep down, he knew that was a lie. The war had ended more than a decade ago, and while slavery was illegal, men like the merchant on that platform had found ways around the law, preying on immigrant women, orphans, and anyone else vulnerable enough to fall into their clutches. The crowd parted as he approached, his 6'3" frame and hard-won reputation preceding him. Xavier was known throughout the territory as a fair man, but not one to cross. He wore his brown hair longer than was fashionable, and his beard was thick against the cold. His eyes, a startling shade of blue-gray, missed nothing. The woman on the platform was shivering violently, her thin dress offering no protection against the elements. She could not have been standing there long, but already her lips were taking on a bluish tint. Her hair, a rich auburn color, hung in tangled waves past her shoulders, partially obscuring her face. She kept her eyes downcast, her arms wrapped around herself in a futile attempt to preserve warmth. "What am I bid for this one?" The merchant called out, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "She's quiet, obedient, and young enough to train to your liking." "Where did you get her?" Xavier heard himself ask, his voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The merchant's eyes narrowed as he assessed Xavier, clearly trying to determine if this question came from a place of interest or challenge. "Found her abandoned at a railway station. No family, no prospects. I'm doing her a favor, really, providing her with a home and purpose." "Found her or took her?" Xavier pressed. "Does it matter?" the merchant sneered. "She's got no papers, no one looking for her. She's mine to sell, legal and proper." Xavier doubted that was true, but he also knew that without proof, the local law would not intervene. Sheriff Morrison was more interested in keeping the peace than in justice, and a friendless woman held no political value in his calculations. $50, someone called from the back of the crowd. 75, another countered. Xavier watched as the woman's shoulders tensed with each new bid. She had not looked up once, had not made a sound. Something about her stillness struck him as different from mere fear. There was a quality to her silence that suggested she had retreated somewhere deep inside herself, somewhere these men could not touch. $100, Xavier said clearly. The crowd fell silent. It was an outrageous sum for this type of transaction, more than twice what the bidding had reached. The merchant's eyes gleamed with greed. $100. Do I hear 125? No one spoke. $100 was a fortune to most of the men present, representing months of wages for a ranch hand or miner, going once, going twice. Sold to the trapper. Xavier pushed through the crowd and mounted the platform. Up close, he could see that the woman was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 22 or 23. Her face, though pale and drawn with cold, held a delicate beauty that the harsh circumstances could not completely obscure. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her cheekbones were too prominent, speaking of missed meals and hard times. He shrugged off his heavy buffalo coat and draped it over her shoulders. The garment swallowed her small frame, but he saw the infinitesimal relaxation of her muscles as the warmth enveloped her. "Can you walk?" he asked quietly. For the first time, she raised her eyes to his. They were a remarkable shade of green, like new leaves in spring, and they held a depth of sadness that hit Xavier like a physical blow. She gave a small nod but said nothing. The merchant thrust a piece of paper at Xavier, some mockery of a bill of sale that would never hold up in a real court of law. Xavier took it without reading it and pulled a leather pouch from his belt. He counted out $100 in gold coins, each one striking the merchant's palm with a solid clink. "Pleasure doing business," the merchant said, already turning to pocket his earnings. Xavier placed a hand on the man's arm, stopping him. "If I ever see you in this town again conducting this kind of business, we will have a problem. Do you understand?" The merchant tried to pull away, but Xavier's grip was iron. "You threatening me? I got witnesses here that'll say you attacked me unprovoked." Xavier looked around at the crowd, his gaze settling on each man until they looked away. "Anyone here willing to testify to that?" Silence. "Did not think so," Xavier said, releasing the merchant with enough force to make him stumble. "Get out of Reno, tonight." The merchant opened his mouth as if to argue, then thought better of it. He scurried off the platform and disappeared into the gathering dusk. Xavier turned back to the woman, who was watching him with an unreadable expression. "I have rooms at the boarding house on Main Street. Mrs. Chen runs a respectable establishment. I will get you a room there, and we can sort out what comes next once you are warm and fed." She nodded again, but still did not speak. They made their way through the muddy streets, Xavier leading the way while keeping a careful eye on his companion. She moved stiffly, whether from cold or fear or something else, he could not tell. The boarding house was a two-story building with a wide porch and smoke rising invitingly from its chimneys. Mrs. Chen met them at the door, her shrewd eyes taking in the situation immediately. She was a Chinese immigrant who had arrived in Nevada during the railway construction boom and had built a successful business through hard work and careful navigation of the prejudices of the time. "Mr. Oakley," she said with a slight bow of her head, "you need 2 rooms now." "Yes, madam." "And if you could provide the lady with a hot bath and a meal, I would be grateful. Add it to my bill." Mrs. Chen studied the woman for a long moment, then nodded. "Come with me, child. We will get you taken care of." The woman looked at Xavier, a question in her eyes. "Go on," he said gently. "You are safe here. Mrs. Chen is a good woman. I will be in the dining room when you are ready to talk, but there is no rush. Take all the time you need." As Mrs. Chen led the woman upstairs, Xavier made his way to the dining room and collapsed into a chair. His hands were shaking slightly, a combination of cold and the adrenaline draining from his system. He had just spent $100, nearly his entire profit from the season, on a woman whose name he did not even know. It was impulsive and foolish, and he knew his father would have boxed his ears for such poor business sense. But he also knew he would make the same choice again without hesitation. Mrs. Chen brought him coffee and a plate of beef stew without being asked. "That girl has been through something terrible," she said quietly. "Her eyes are old." "I know," Xavier replied. "What will you do with her?" It was a fair question, one he had been asking himself. I do not know yet. Help her if she will let me. Mrs. Chen nodded as if this answer satisfied her. You are a good man, Xavier Oakley. Your mother would be proud. The mention of his mother, dead these 5 years, brought a familiar ache to Xavier's chest. She had been the one who taught him that a person's worth was not measured by their station in life, but by how they treated those who could do nothing for them in return. Nearly 2 hours passed before the woman appeared in the dining room doorway. She had bathed and changed into a simple cotton dress that Mrs. Chen must have provided. Her hair, clean and dried, fell in soft waves around her face. She looked fragile as spun glass, but there was something else now too, a spark of life that had not been present before. Xavier stood as she approached, pulling out a chair for her. She sat carefully, her hands folded in her lap. Mrs. Chen will bring you some food, Xavier said, sitting back down across from her. You must be hungry. She nodded. They sat in silence for a moment, Xavier unsure how to begin this conversation. Finally, he said, My name is Xavier Oakley. I am a trapper and hunter. I have a cabin up in the mountains, but I come down to Reno every few months for supplies. The woman watched him but said nothing. I do not. Xavier paused, choosing his words carefully. I did not buy you to own you. That paper means nothing to me. I bought you to get you away from that situation. You are free to go wherever you want, whenever you want. I will help you get wherever you need to be. Still, she remained silent. Mrs. Chen arrived with a plate of stew and fresh bread. The woman looked at the food with such longing that Xavier felt his throat tighten. She picked up the spoon, then paused and looked at him. Eat, he said softly. Please. She did not need to be told twice. She ate with careful, deliberate movements, not rushing despite her obvious hunger. It spoke of training, of having been taught proper manners in another life. When she had finished half the plate, she set down her spoon and took a sip of water. Then, for the first time, she spoke. I am not what you think I am. Her voice was quiet but clear, with an educated accent that belonged in a drawing room, not on an auction block. Xavier found himself leaning forward, wanting to catch every word. What do you mean? He asked. She met his eyes directly. I am not some helpless victim who needs rescuing. I am not a child, and I am not. She paused, struggling for words. I am not broken. Xavier absorbed this, understanding that she was setting boundaries, claiming agency in a situation where she had been stripped of all power. I never thought you were, he said honestly. Broken, I mean. Hungry, cold, and in a bad situation, yes, but not broken. Something shifted in her expression, a slight softening around her eyes. My name is Natalie Kensington. I was born in Boston. My father was a professor of history at Harvard. My mother died when I was 12. My father remarried when I was 19, and my stepmother and I. She hesitated. We did not get along. When my father died 6 months ago, she made it clear I was no longer welcome in the house. She provided me with a train ticket west and $50, and told me to make my own way. Xavier felt anger burning in his chest at this story, at the casual cruelty of a woman who would cast out her dead husband's daughter. Natalie continued, I arrived in Sacramento with plans to find work as a teacher or governess, but I became ill on the journey, some kind of fever. I spent 3 weeks in a charity hospital, and by the time I recovered, my money was gone, stolen by someone at the hospital. I made my way to Reno on foot and by catching rides on freight wagons, hoping to find work. But no one would hire me without references or respectable lodgings, and I could not afford lodgings without work. She took another sip of water, her hand steady despite the difficult memories. I was sleeping in a church doorway when that merchant found me 3 days ago. He said he would help me find work. Instead, He locked me in a storage room and told me I would be sold to pay for his kindness in taking me off the streets. That man was not kind, Xavier said, his voice rough with suppressed rage. That man was a predator. I know, Natalie said simply, but I also know that I am alive and I am here and I am still myself despite everything that has happened. That is what I meant when I said I am not broken. They tried to break me, everyone from my stepmother to that merchant, but they failed. In that moment, Xavier Oakley, who had spent the better part of a decade avoiding emotional entanglements, felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. This woman, who had every reason to give up, who had been betrayed by family and circumstance, still possessed a core of strength that shone through like light through a cracked door. "What do you want to do now?" he asked. Natalie considered the question seriously. "I do not know," she admitted. "For the first time in my life, I truly do not know what comes next. I have no family, no money, no prospects. But I also have no one controlling me, no one dictating my choices. It is terrifying and liberating in equal measure." "You said you wanted to teach." "I did. I do." She smiled slightly, the expression transforming her face. "I love learning and I love sharing knowledge with others. My father taught me Latin, Greek, history, literature, mathematics. I can read and write in 3 languages. But those skills mean little when you are a woman alone with no respectable connections." Xavier thought for a moment. "There is a settlement about 20 miles north of here, a farming community called Silver Creek. They have been trying to attract a school teacher for over a year, but the position does not pay much, and most qualified teachers prefer the larger towns. If you are serious about teaching, I could introduce you to the community leaders there." Hope flickered across Natalie's face, then died. "I have no credentials, no letters of reference." "You have me," Xavier said. "My word carries weight in these parts. I could vouch for your character and education." "You do not know me," Natalie pointed out. "How can you vouch for me?" Xavier considered this. "I know that you have survived circumstances that would have destroyed a weaker person. I know that you speak with education and intelligence. I know that you have dignity and strength. That is enough for me." Natalie studied him for a long moment, her green eyes searching his face. "Why are you doing this? You spent a fortune to buy me, and now you are offering to help me find employment. What do you gain from this?" It was a fair question, and one Xavier had been asking himself. The honest answer was complicated, bound up in memories of his mother's kindness, his own loneliness, and something he saw in Natalie that called to a part of himself he had thought long dead. "My mother used to say that we are judged not by what we do when it is easy, but by what we do when it costs us something," Xavier said slowly. "Maybe I am trying to live up to her example. Or maybe I am tired of being alone and wanted to do something that mattered. I do not have a simple answer for you." Natalie absorbed this, then said something that changed everything. "Or maybe you are just as lonely as I am, and you recognized a kindred spirit." The words hit Xavier like a bullet, piercing through all the defenses he had built over the years. She had seen through him with frightening accuracy, had identified the core truth he barely acknowledged to himself. He was lonely. He had been lonely for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to be otherwise. "Yes," he said simply. "Maybe that is it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, a understanding passing between them that needed no words. Outside, the snow continued to fall, muffling the sounds of the town and creating a cocoon of quiet around the boarding house. "I would like to see this settlement," Natalie said finally. "Silver Creek. If you are willing to take me there, I would like to apply for the teaching position." "We will leave in the morning," Xavier agreed. "The weather should clear enough for travel by then. It is only a day's ride if we start early." "I do not have a horse," Natalie pointed out. You can ride with me. My horse is strong enough to carry us both." A faint blush colored Natalie's cheeks, and Xavier realized the intimacy such an arrangement would require. "Or I could rent a second horse from the livery," he added quickly. "That might be more appropriate." "Appropriate," Natalie repeated, a hint of amusement in her voice. "I was nearly sold on an auction block this afternoon, and you are worried about the appropriateness of sharing a horse." Xavier found himself smiling despite the grim humor. "Fair point. But you are right that it would be more comfortable with two horses," Natalie continued. "If you can afford the rental, I would appreciate it." "I can afford it," Xavier assured her, though in truth, his funds were running low after the purchase price he had paid. He would manage somehow, Mrs. Chen appeared to clear the dishes. "I have prepared a room for the young lady," she said. "It is small but clean and warm." Natalie stood, swaying slightly with exhaustion. The meal and warmth had caught up with her, and Xavier could see she was barely staying on her feet. "Get some rest," he said gently. "We will talk more in the morning." "Mr. Oakley," Natalie said as she turned to follow Mrs. Chen. "Thank you. I know I have already said it, but I need you to understand how much this means. You gave me back my future today." Xavier nodded, not trusting his voice. As he watched her climb the stairs, he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. He had inserted himself into this woman's life, and now he needed to follow through on his promises. But more than that, he wanted to. For the first time in years, he felt a sense of purpose beyond simple survival. He spent the evening sitting by the fire in the boarding house parlor, drinking coffee and thinking about the strange turns life could take. This morning, his biggest concern had been whether the furs would fetch a good price. Now he found himself responsible for a woman whose eyes haunted him, and whose words had stripped away his carefully constructed solitude. The snow stopped falling around midnight. Xavier stood at the parlor window, watching as the clouds cleared to reveal a sky full of stars. The temperature would drop even further now, making tomorrow's journey difficult but not impossible. He would need to purchase warm clothing for Natalie, supplies for the trip, and arrange for horses. His dwindling funds would be stretched thin, but he would make it work. As he finally made his way to his own room, Xavier admitted to himself what he had known since the moment Natalie spoke her first words. He was not doing this purely out of altruism. He was drawn to her in a way that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her strength, her intelligence, her refusal to be diminished by circumstances, all of it called to something deep within him. But he also knew that she needed freedom and independence, not another man trying to control her life. Whatever his feelings, he would help her get established in Silver Creek, and then he would step back and let her make her own choices. That was the only honorable path forward, even if it meant walking away from the most interesting person he had met in years. Morning arrived cold and bright. Xavier rose before dawn and made his way to the general store as soon as it opened. He purchased a heavy wool coat for Natalie, along with warm gloves, a scarf, and sturdy boots. He also bought supplies for the journey: dried meat, hardtack, coffee, and a canteen. At the livery, he arranged for a gentle mare to be rented for the trip to Silver Creek, paying extra for a saddle designed for a woman's riding style. By the time he returned to the boarding house, Natalie was already awake and dressed in the simple cotton dress from the previous evening. She looked rested but nervous. "Good morning," Xavier said, setting his packages on a table. "I got you some things for the journey. It is going to be cold." Natalie opened the packages, her eyes widening as she saw the quality of the clothing. "This is too much," she protested. "You have already spent so much on my behalf. Winter in Nevada is unforgiving," Xavier said practically. "I would rather you be warm than save a few dollars." Natalie touched the wool coat with something like reverence. "I will pay you back," she said firmly. "Once I have employment and income, I will repay every cent you have spent on me." "There is no debt," Xavier said, "but if it makes you feel better to think of it as a loan, that is fine." They ate breakfast together, a simple meal of eggs and toast. Xavier found himself watching Natalie as she ate, noticing small details, the way she held her fork, the unconscious grace of her movements, the intelligence in her eyes as she observed the other boarders. She caught him looking once and raised an eyebrow in question, but he just shook his head and returned to his own meal. After breakfast, Natalie changed into her new warm clothing. When she emerged from her room, Xavier felt his breath catch. The coat fit her perfectly, and the deep blue color brought out the green of her eyes. Her hair was braided and pinned up under a wool hat, and she looked like she belonged in this rough country, despite her Boston upbringing. "Will this do?" she asked, clearly mistaking his stare for disapproval. "It is perfect," Xavier managed. "You look ready for the journey." They thanked Mrs. Chen for her hospitality, and Xavier pressed extra money into the woman's hand to cover the room and any additional expenses. Mrs. Chen tried to protest, but Xavier insisted. "You treated her with kindness when you could have turned us away," Xavier said. "That is worth more than gold." At the livery, Natalie approached the mare with confidence, running her hand along the horse's neck and speaking to it in low, soothing tones. "You know horses," Xavier observed. "My father kept horses for riding," Natalie explained. "Before he remarried, we would ride together every Sunday through the Boston Common. It was one of our traditions." A shadow of sadness crossed her face. "I have not ridden in nearly 2 years." Xavier helped her mount, making sure she was secure in the saddle. Then he swung up onto his own horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Bear, and they set out north towards Silver Creek. The journey was cold but beautiful. The fresh snow had transformed the landscape into something pristine and otherworldly. Pine trees sagged under the weight of ice, and the air was so clear it almost hurt to breathe. Xavier led the way, keeping the pace steady but not punishing, constantly checking to make sure Natalie was managing. She rode well, sitting straight in the saddle despite the difficult conditions. After an hour, Xavier called a halt to let the horses rest and to share some coffee from the thermos he had packed. "How are you doing?" he asked as Natalie dismounted with only a slight stiffness. "Cold but managing," she replied, accepting the cup of coffee he offered. "It is beautiful out here, different from Boston in every way possible." "Do you miss it, Boston?" Natalie considered the question. "I miss what it represented, my father, my childhood, a life that made sense. But the actual place? No, there is nothing for me there anymore. The house where I grew up belongs to my stepmother now, and all my father's friends have forgotten I exist." She took a sip of coffee. "Sometimes I think the West is where people come when they have nowhere else to go." "That is true for some," Xavier agreed. "But for others, it is where they come to start over, to build something new. Maybe both things can be true at once." "Is that why you are here, starting over?" Xavier was quiet for a moment, surprised by how much he wanted to answer honestly. "I came out here after the war," he said. "I was 23 years old and had seen things that made me question everything I thought I knew about humanity. My father wanted me to take over his business in Kansas, but I could not go back to that life. I needed space and silence. I needed to be somewhere that the war had not touched. Did you find what you were looking for?" "I found peace, or something close to it. I found a way to live with myself." Xavier looked at her directly. "But I also found loneliness, even though I did not realize it until recently." Natalie met his gaze, understanding passing between them. "We are both running from ghosts then." "Maybe so. but maybe we are also running toward something new, even if we do not know what that is yet." They remounted and continued north. As they rode, they talked about easier subjects, books they had read, places they had seen, small memories from childhood. Xavier learned that Natalie had wanted to be a scholar like her father, that she could recite entire passages of Virgil in Latin, that she loved autumn most of all the seasons. Natalie learned that Xavier had grown up on a farm, that he had a younger sister who had died of fever when she was 10, that he played the harmonica, but only when he was certain no one could hear him. The conversation flowed easily, naturally, as if they had known each other for years rather than hours. Xavier found himself sharing things he had never told another person, drawn out by Natalie's genuine interest and her own willingness to be vulnerable. They reached Silver Creek as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon. The settlement was small, perhaps 30 buildings clustered around a main street, with farms spreading out in all directions. Smoke rose from chimneys, and Xavier could see children playing in the snow near one of the houses. "It is tiny," Natalie observed, but there was no disappointment in her voice, only assessment. "Tiny but growing," Xavier said. "These are good people, mostly families who are trying to build something stable. They need a teacher for their children, someone who can give them a real education." They rode to the largest building in town, which served as both general store and community meeting place. Xavier helped Natalie dismount, then led her inside where warmth and the smell of wood smoke greeted them. A man in his late 40s stood behind the counter, measuring out flour for an elderly woman. He looked up as they entered, and his weathered face broke into a smile. "Xavier Oakley. Did not expect to see you down from the mountains so soon." "Hello, Samuel," Xavier said, shaking the man's hand. "I have someone I would like you to meet." Samuel Carson was the de facto leader of Silver Creek, a former soldier who had come west with his wife and children to farm. He was respected for his fairness and his ability to see the best in people. Xavier made the introductions, explaining Natalie's background and her interest in the teaching position. Samuel listened carefully, asking thoughtful questions about her education and experience. Natalie answered with confidence, her intelligence and passion for learning shining through. "I will be honest with you, Miss Kensington," Samuel said when she finished. "We are a small community with limited resources. The teaching position pays $30 a month, plus room and board in the schoolhouse. It is not much, and the work is hard. You would be teaching children ranging from age 5 to 15, all in one room, but we need someone desperately. These children deserve an education, and we have not been able to attract a qualified teacher." "I would like to try," Natalie said simply. "I understand the challenges, but I believe I can do this." Samuel looked at Xavier. "You vouch for her character." "I do," Xavier said without hesitation. "She is educated, capable, and determined. Your children would be lucky to have her." Samuel nodded slowly. "Then the position is yours if you want it. We can introduce you to the families tomorrow, and you can start teaching next week once the school building is prepared." Natalie's face lit up with a joy so pure it took Xavier's breath away. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You will not regret this." Samuel showed them the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building at the edge of town. It had been built with care, with real windows and a good stove for heat. Attached to the back was a small living quarters, just one room with a bed, a table, and a stove, but it was clean and would be private. The previous teacher was a man who had been promised this position, Samuel explained. But he got a better offer in Carson City and never arrived. "We have been managing with the children learning at home, but it is not ideal." After Samuel left, Natalie walked through her new home, touching the furniture with gentle hands. Xavier stood in the doorway, watching her explore. "It is perfect," she said finally, turning to face him. "It is small and simple, but it is mine. Do you understand? For the first time since my father died, I have something that belongs to me, a place in the world." "You deserve it," Xavier said. "You deserve so much more than this, but it is a start." Natalie crossed the room until she stood directly in front of him. "None of this would have happened without you. You saw me at my lowest point, and instead of taking advantage, you gave me a chance at a new life. I do not know how to thank you for that." Xavier looked down at her, acutely aware of how close she was, of the way her eyes reflected the lamplight, of the soft curve of her mouth. He wanted to tell her that no thanks were necessary, that helping her had given him something to a sense of purpose, a connection to another human being, a reason to care about something beyond his own survival. But the words stuck in his throat, too raw and honest to be spoken aloud. Instead, he said, "You gave yourself this chance. I just provided a horse and an introduction. The rest was all you." Natalie reached out and took his hand, a simple gesture that sent electricity through Xavier's entire body. "Stay," she said quietly. "Not tonight, but stay in Silver Creek for a few days. Help me get settled. I know you need to return to your cabin, but could you spare a little more time?" Xavier knew he should say no. Every practical consideration said he needed to head back to the mountains, to prepare for the rest of winter, to return to his solitary life. But looking at Natalie, seeing the hope and vulnerability in her eyes, he found himself nodding. "I will stay," he said. "I will make sure you are settled, and the town accepts you before I leave." Relief and something else, something warmer, flashed across Natalie's face. "Thank you," she whispered. Samuel had arranged for them to stay at the boarding house of a widow named Mrs. Fletcher that night. The older woman was kind but curious, asking pointed questions about Xavier and Natalie's relationship that made them both uncomfortable. "We are friends," Natalie said firmly. "Mr. Oakley helped me when I needed assistance, and now he is making sure I am established in my new position." Mrs. Fletcher clearly did not believe this was the whole story, but she was polite enough not to press further. The next few days passed in a blur of activity. Samuel introduced Natalie to all the families with school-age children. Some were skeptical of hiring a woman so young, but Natalie won them over with her knowledge and obvious passion for teaching. She spent hours preparing the schoolhouse, organizing the meager supplies, and creating lesson plans for students at different levels. Xavier helped where he could, chopping wood for the school's stove, repairing a leak in the roof, building additional shelves for books. He found excuses to be near her, to hear her laugh as she described her plans for teaching, to watch her face light up when she talked about literature or history. He was falling in love with her, and that realization terrified him. On the third evening, as they sat together in the schoolhouse after a day of preparation, Natalie turned to him with serious eyes. "You are planning to leave soon," she said. It was not a question. "I need to get back to my cabin," Xavier admitted. "Winter is far from over and I have responsibilities there." "I understand," Natalie said, but there was sadness in her voice. I wish you did not have to go. These past few days have been the happiest I have known in a very long time." Xavier felt his heart constrict. "I have been happy too," he said quietly. "Happier than I can remember being." They looked at each other across the small table, the air between them charged with unspoken feelings. "Can I ask you something?" Natalie said finally. "Anything." "That first day when you saw me on that platform, what made you stop? What made you bid?" Xavier thought about lying, about giving her some noble answer about justice and morality. But Natalie deserved honesty. "I saw you," he said simply. "I saw your strength and your dignity despite everything that was being done to you." And I thought that anyone who could hold themselves together like that, who could survive what you had survived, was someone extraordinary. I could not walk away from that. From you." Natalie's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I saw you too," she whispered. "When you put your coat around me, when you asked if I could walk instead of just grabbing me, I saw kindness I thought had disappeared from the world. And every day since then, you have shown me that there are still good people, still reasons to hope." Xavier stood and moved around the table, pulled by a force he could not resist. He knelt beside Natalie's chair so they were at eye level. "I am going to say something," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "And you can ignore it if you want. You do not owe me anything, and I do not want you to feel obligated to respond, but I need you to know." Natalie nodded, her eyes locked on his. "I am falling in love with you," Xavier said. "Maybe I have been since the moment I heard you speak, since you told me you were not broken. I know the timing is terrible. I know you need space to build your own life. But I also know that I cannot leave without telling you the truth. You have changed something in me, Natalie. You have made me want things I had given up on: companionship, family, a future that includes another person. I'm not asking you to feel the same way. I just needed you to know." For a long moment, Natalie said nothing. Then, slowly, she reached out and cupped Xavier's face with both hands. "I am falling in love with you too," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "And it terrifies me because I spent so long being controlled by others, by my stepmother, by circumstances, by that horrible merchant. I swore I would never let anyone have that kind of power over me again." "Love is not about power or control," Xavier said softly. "It is about choice. Every day you choose to be with someone. Every day they choose you back. I would never try to control you or limit you. I would only want to support you and share in your life if you would let me." Natalie leaned forward and pressed her forehead against his. "I am so scared," she whispered. "I know. So am I." They stayed like that for a long moment, breathing together, finding comfort in the contact. Then Natalie pulled back slightly and looked at Xavier with determination. "I need time," she said. "I need to establish myself here, to prove to myself that I can survive on my own, but I do not want to lose you either. Is there a way we can have both things?" Xavier thought carefully before answering. "I could come back," he said. "In the spring, after the worst of winter has passed. By then, you will be settled in your position and we can see how we feel. No pressure, no expectations. Just an opportunity to explore what is between us." "That is 4 months away," Natalie said. "I know. But if what we feel is real, it will still be there in 4 months. And if it is not, then we will have saved ourselves pain." Natalie nodded slowly. "You are right. That is the sensible thing to do." She smiled slightly. "When did I become sensible? I used to be so impulsive." "You are allowed to be both sensible and impulsive," Xavier said, standing and pulling her up with him. "Being careful does not mean you are afraid. It means you are smart." The next morning, Xavier prepared to leave. He had delayed as long as he could, but the weather was worsening again, and he needed to return to his cabin before he got trapped in Silver Creek for the winter. Natalie walked with him to the livery where Bear was saddled and waiting. She had wrapped herself in the blue coat he had bought her, and the cold had brought color to her cheeks. "For months," she said, as if confirming the time frame. "For months," Xavier agreed. "April, when the mountain passes are clear, I will come back to see how you are doing. And if I have changed my mind, then we will be friends, and I will be happy you found your place in the world." Natalie stepped close and wrapped her arms around him in a fierce embrace. Xavier held her tightly, memorizing the feel of her in his arms, the scent of her hair, the way she fit perfectly against his chest. "Be safe," she whispered against his coat. "You too. Remember, Samuel is a good man. If you need anything, go to him." They separated, and Xavier swung up onto Bear's back. He looked down at Natalie, at her beautiful, determined face, and felt his heart twist with the difficulty of leaving. "I will write," he said. "If Samuel has a way to get letters to you, he does. A mail rider comes through once a month. Then expect to hear from me." Xavier turned Bear toward the mountains and rode out of Silver Creek without looking back. If he had looked back, he would not have had the strength to leave. The journey back to his cabin was brutally cold and lonely. Xavier had gotten used to having Natalie's company, to hearing her voice and her laughter, to the comfortable silences they shared. Now, alone with only his horse and the empty winter landscape, he felt the solitude like a physical ache. His cabin was exactly as he had left it, but it felt different now, smaller and more isolated than he remembered. Xavier threw himself into work, hunting and trapping, maintaining his shelter, preparing for the long months ahead. But every night, as he sat by his fire, he thought about Natalie. He wondered if she was warm enough, if her students were giving her trouble, if she was happy in her new life. He wrote letters by firelight, long, rambling messages about his days, about memories from his childhood, about his thoughts on books they had discussed. He shared things he had never told anyone, feeling safe in the knowledge that Natalie would understand. Once a month, he made the difficult journey down to Silver Creek to post his letters and pick up her responses. Natalie's letters were equally detailed and personal. She wrote about her students' 10 children, ranging from little Emma, who was 5 and could barely read, to Thomas, who was 14 and questioned everything. She described the families, the rhythms of small-town life, the satisfaction she found in teaching. She shared her fears, too, that she was not good enough, that the families would decide she was too young and inexperienced, that she would fail. But more than anything, she wrote about missing him. "I find myself looking for you," she wrote in a letter that arrived in late February. "When something interesting happens, my first thought is to tell you about it. When I am struggling with a lesson plan, I wish I could ask your opinion. The schoolhouse feels empty in the evenings, and I realize it is not the space that is empty, but rather the absence of your presence. 4 months seemed like a reasonable time when you left, but now it feels like an eternity." Xavier read that letter so many times he could recite it from memory. He carried it with him when he checked his trap lines, folded carefully in his pocket, a tangible reminder that someone in the world was thinking of him. Winter slowly gave way to early spring. The snow began to melt, revealing the brown earth beneath. Xavier watched the ice break up on the streams and felt his own anticipation building. Soon he would be able to travel again. Soon he would see Natalie. But as March turned into April, a late-season storm trapped him in his cabin for nearly 2 weeks. Xavier paced like a caged animal, watching the snow pile up outside his windows, counting the days until he could leave. When the storm finally broke and the sun returned, he packed his belongings with frantic speed. It was the 3rd week of April when Xavier finally rode into Silver Creek. He had bathed in a freezing stream that morning and put on his best clothes, not fancy, but clean and mended. His heart pounded as he approached the schoolhouse, nerves making his hands shake slightly. It was mid-afternoon, and he could hear voices from inside the building, Natalie leading her students through a recitation of some kind. Xavier dismounted and tied Bear to the hitching post, then waited outside, not wanting to interrupt the lesson. After about 10 minutes, the door opened and children spilled out, laughing and talking. They looked at Xavier with curious eyes, and one brave girl about 8 years old approached him. "Are you Miss Kensington's friend?" she asked. "The trapper she talks about sometimes." Xavier felt warmth spread through his chest at the knowledge that Natalie had mentioned him. "Yes, I am Xavier Oakley." She said you would come back in the spring, the girl said matter-of-factly. She has been watching for you. The children dispersed, heading toward their homes, and finally, Xavier was alone outside the schoolhouse. He took a deep breath and opened the door. Natalie was at her desk, organizing papers. She looked up as he entered, and her face transformed with joy. She dropped what she was holding and ran across the room, throwing herself into his arms with such force that he stumbled backward. "You came," she said against his chest. "I was starting to worry that you had changed your mind." "Never," Xavier said, holding her tightly. "A storm delayed me, or I would have been here 2 weeks ago." Natalie pulled back to look at him, her hands framing his face. "You look thinner. Have you been eating enough?" "I look thin. You are the one who feels like you have lost weight." "Teaching is more exhausting than I anticipated," Natalie admitted. "But it is good, Xavier. It is everything I hoped it would be." They stood there, drinking in the sight of each other, cataloging the small changes 4 months had wrought. Xavier thought Natalie looked more confident, more settled in herself. There was a lightness about her that had not been present in winter. "Walk with me," Natalie asked. "I want to show you what has happened while you were gone." They walked through Silver Creek together, and Natalie introduced him to her students' families. Everyone greeted Xavier warmly, clearly aware of his role in bringing their beloved teacher to town. Xavier could see how much Natalie had integrated into this community, how she had built a life for herself. "I am proud of you," he said as they walked along the stream at the edge of town. "You have done exactly what you set out to do." "I could not have done it without you," Natalie said. "Yes, you could have. You just needed an opportunity. The rest was all you." Natalie stopped walking and turned to face him. "Have you thought about us, about what happens now?" "I have thought of little else," Xavier admitted. "Have you? Every day?" Natalie took his hands. "I know what I want, Xavier. I want you. I want a life together, but I do not know how that works when you live in the mountains and I live here." Xavier had spent the winter thinking about exactly this problem. "I have an idea if you are willing to listen." "I am listening." "You finish out the school year here. Another 2 months. During that time, I will find us a place near Silver Creek, a piece of land where I can build a house. In the summers, when school is not in session, we could spend time at my mountain cabin if you wanted, but our primary home would be here so you can continue teaching. I would trap and hunt as I always have, but I would be here with you when you needed me." Natalie's eyes widened. "You would give up your solitude for me." "I would give up loneliness for us," Xavier corrected. "There is a difference. I thought I wanted to be alone, but what I really wanted was peace. And I have found more peace in these few minutes with you than I have had in 10 years alone in the mountains." Tears spilled down Natalie's cheeks. "Are you asking me to marry you?" Xavier felt his breath catch. He had been thinking it, but hearing the words out loud made them suddenly real and terrifying and wonderful all at once. "Yes," he said. "I am asking you to marry me. Not right away, but when you are ready. When you feel secure enough in your independence that you know choosing me is not giving up any part of yourself." Natalie laughed through her tears. "You are asking me to marry you, but telling me to take my time about answering. I want you to be sure. I want there to be no doubt in your mind that this is what you want." Natalie stepped close and kissed him, soft and sweet and full of promise. It was the first time their lips had met, and Xavier felt the world narrow to just this moment, just this woman in his arms. When they finally separated, Natalie smiled at him with such love it took his breath away. "I am sure," she said. "I have been sure since February, maybe since the day you left. I love you, Xavier Oakley. I want to build a life with you, and yes, I will marry you." Xavier pulled her close again, burying his face in her hair, feeling emotion overwhelm him. He had not cried since his mother died, but he felt tears burning in his eyes now, tears of joy and relief and gratitude. "I love you," he whispered. "I will spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret this choice." They were married in June, in a simple ceremony at the Silver Creek Church. Natalie wore a dress sewn by some of the mothers from her school, pale blue like the coat Xavier had bought her that first day. Xavier wore his best suit, borrowed from Samuel. The entire town attended, celebrating the union of their teacher and the quiet trapper who had won her heart. Mrs. Chen traveled from Reno to attend, bringing with her an exquisite quilt as a wedding gift. "I knew the first night," she told Xavier as they danced at the reception. "I knew you two would be together. It was written in how you looked at each other." Xavier had spent the spring building a small house on a piece of land just outside Silver Creek. It was simple but well crafted, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a sitting room. There was a barn for horses and a root cellar for storage. It was not grand, but it was theirs. Natalie continued teaching and Xavier continued his work, but everything was different now. He woke beside her each morning, and they ate breakfast together before she left for the schoolhouse. He spent his days hunting, trapping, and working on improving their home and land. In the evenings, they would cook together, read together, talk about their days. The intimacy of married life was an adjustment for both of them. Xavier had spent so long alone that having another person constantly present took getting used to. But he found he craved Natalie's presence, missed her when she was at school, felt incomplete without her nearby. For Natalie, learning to trust fully, to allow someone to see all of her, was both frightening and freeing. She had spent so long protecting herself, maintaining walls against hurt, that it took time to let those defenses down. But Xavier was patient, never pushing, always waiting for her to come to him. Their first real argument happened in August, about something trivial, whether to plant apple trees or pear trees in their small orchard. But the disagreement escalated, both of them bringing old fears and insecurities into the discussion. Natalie accused Xavier of trying to control her decisions, and Xavier accused Natalie of not really trusting him. They went to bed angry, lying on opposite sides of the mattress, not touching. Xavier stared at the ceiling in the darkness, feeling miserable and stupid. This was exactly what he had feared, that he would somehow ruin the best thing in his life. "Xavier," Natalie's voice was small in the darkness. "Yes, I am sorry. I was being ridiculous. Plant whatever trees you think are best. I trust your judgment." "No," Xavier said, rolling to face her. "You were right. I was not really asking your opinion. I was telling you what I had already decided. That is not how this is supposed to work." They reached for each other in the darkness, meeting in the middle of the bed. "We are not very good at this yet," Natalie said. "No," Xavier agreed, "but we will get better. We will learn." "How do you know?" "Because we both want this to work. That has to count for something." Natalie kissed him, and the argument was forgotten. In the morning, they went to the nursery together and chose a mix of apple and pear trees, compromising, learning to blend their separate desires into shared decisions. The school year brought new challenges. Some of the families were uncomfortable with Natalie being married now, worried that she would leave to start a family of her own. Natalie had to work hard to reassure them that she was committed to her students, that marriage did not mean the end of her career. Xavier was learning too, discovering the complexities of being part of a community after years of isolation. He joined the local men for town meetings, helped repair the church roof after a storm, participated in barn raisings for new families. It was strange and uncomfortable at first, but gradually he began to see the value in these connections. In November, Natalie fainted during a lesson. Emma, the little girl who had been Xavier's informant that day he returned to Silver Creek, ran to get Xavier from the fields where he was working. He arrived at the schoolhouse to find Natalie sitting in a chair, pale but conscious, surrounded by worried students. "I am fine," she insisted as Xavier gently dismissed the children for the day. "I just stood up too quickly." But when it happened again a week later, Xavier insisted they visit the doctor in the next town over. Dr. Miller was an older man with a kind face and gentle hands. After examining Natalie, he smiled at them both. "Congratulations," he said. "You are going to be parents." Xavier felt the world tilt on its axis. A baby. They were going to have a baby. He looked at Natalie, who had gone even paler than before. "I cannot have a baby," she said, her voice rising with panic. "I am a teacher. The families depend on me. I cannot abandon my students." "You would not be abandoning them," Dr. Miller said calmly. "Women have been teaching while pregnant for as long as there have been schools. You will need to rest more, take precautions, but there is no reason you cannot continue your work until close to your time." But Natalie was inconsolable. On the ride home, she cried, overwhelmed by fear and uncertainty. Xavier held her that night as she talked through her anxieties that she would lose her position, that the town would reject her, that she would have to give up the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. "We will figure it out," Xavier promised. "Together. No matter what happens, we will find a way." Gradually, Natalie came to terms with the pregnancy. The families of Silver Creek were supportive, assuring her that her position was secure. The women of the town gathered to help prepare for the baby, sewing tiny clothes and offering advice. Even Samuel, who could be stern about matters of propriety, was delighted at the news. Natalie continued teaching through the winter and into the spring, finally leaving her post in May as her pregnancy advanced. A young man from a nearby town was hired as a temporary replacement, with the understanding that Natalie would return to her position when she was ready. Their son was born on a warm June evening after a labor that terrified Xavier and exhausted Natalie. Dr. Miller attended the birth, along with Mrs. Fletcher and several other women from town. Xavier was banished to the sitting room, where he wore a path in the floorboards with his pacing. When he finally heard the baby's cry, he felt his knees go weak with relief. Mrs. Fletcher emerged to tell him he had a healthy son, and that Natalie was doing well. Xavier was allowed into the bedroom, where he found Natalie propped up in bed, exhausted but smiling, holding a tiny bundle. "Meet your son," she said softly. Xavier approached carefully, almost afraid to look. But when Natalie pulled back the blanket to reveal the baby's face, he felt love slam into him with the force of a physical blow. The baby was perfect, tiny and red-faced, with a wisp of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn out like Natalie's green. "What should we name him?" Natalie asked. They had discussed names but never settled on one. Xavier looked at his wife and son, thinking about all the people who had shaped his life, who had brought him to this moment. "Samuel," he said. "Samuel Henry Oakley, after your father and the man who gave you a chance in Silver Creek." Tears filled Natalie's eyes. "Samuel Henry, I love it." The first weeks with a newborn were brutally difficult. Neither Xavier nor Natalie had much experience with babies, and Samuel seemed determined to challenge them at every turn. He cried frequently, slept irregularly, and demanded constant attention. Xavier and Natalie stumbled through those early days in a fog of exhaustion, taking turns walking the floor with the baby, learning to change diapers and swaddle and soothe. But there were moments of transcendent joy too, the first time Samuel smiled at them. The way he would calm when Xavier sang to him in a low voice, the peaceful weight of him sleeping on Natalie's chest. Xavier would watch his wife with their son and feel his heart expand beyond what he thought possible, Samuel brought challenges to their relationship too. With the baby demanding so much attention, Xavier and Natalie had less time for each other. They were both exhausted, both stressed, and small irritations could blow up into larger conflicts. But they were learning, figuring out how to communicate, how to support each other through the difficulties. One particularly hard night, when Samuel had been crying for hours and nothing would comfort him, Xavier found Natalie sobbing in the kitchen. "I am a terrible mother," she said. "I do not know what he needs. I cannot help him." Xavier took the still crying baby and gently rocked him. "You are not a terrible mother. You are exhausted. We both are. This is hard, but it will get easier." "How do you know?" "Because Mrs. Fletcher told me so. And she raised 7 children, so I am inclined to believe her." Natalie laughed weakly through her tears. Xavier passed Samuel back to her and pulled them both into his arms, the 3 of them standing together in the kitchen at 3 in the morning. A family learning to be whole. By autumn, life had settled into a new rhythm. Samuel was 4 months old, sleeping better, smiling often, beginning to show his personality. Natalie had decided to return to teaching, but only 3 days a week, with one of the mothers from town watching Samuel during those hours. It was not a perfect solution, and Natalie struggled with guilt about leaving her son. But Xavier could see that teaching fulfilled something essential in her, that she was happiest when she could balance both roles. He supported her decision, taking on more of the childcare responsibilities on the days she worked. Xavier had adapted his own work as well. He no longer spent long periods in the mountains, instead focusing on shorter hunting trips closer to home. It meant less income, but Samuel was learning to work with the land in other ways, growing vegetables, raising chickens, doing occasional carpentry work for families in town. Their second winter as a family was easier than the first. They had learned each other's rhythms, figured out how to navigate conflicts, found ways to support each other's needs while caring for their son. Samuel was walking now, tottering around their small house, getting into everything, bringing chaos and joy in equal measure. On Christmas Eve, as they sat by the fire watching Samuel play with the wooden blocks Xavier had carved for him, Natalie leaned against her husband's shoulder. "Are you happy?" she asked. Xavier thought about the question seriously. 2 years ago, he had been alone in a mountain cabin, isolated by choice, convinced that solitude was the only path to peace. Now he was married with a son, living in a small house near a farming community, his life full of noise and responsibility and complication. "I am happier than I ever imagined possible," he said honestly. "There are hard days, moments when I feel overwhelmed or inadequate, but there is not a single moment when I wish for my old life back. Not even a little bit. Do you not miss the solitude, the freedom to do as you pleased?" "I miss the simplicity sometimes," Xavier admitted, "but I would not trade this for anything. You and Samuel are worth every sacrifice, every challenge. You are my family." Natalie kissed him softly. "You gave me everything, you know. That day in Reno when you saw me on that platform, you gave me back my life. But more than that, you gave me a reason to want to live it." "You did the same for me," Xavier said. "I was just existing before you. Now I am alive." The years passed in the way years do, marked by milestones and ordinary moments. Samuel grew into a bright, curious child who loved books like his mother and the outdoors like his father. Natalie continued teaching, becoming one of the most respected educators in the region, with families traveling from other communities to have their children study under her. Xavier's work evolved as well. He became known for his skill at tracking and his knowledge of the land, and he was often hired to guide hunting parties or survey potential farmland. The income was steadier than trapping had been, and it allowed him to be home more often. When Samuel was 4, Natalie became pregnant again. This pregnancy was easier than the first, perhaps because they knew what to expect, or perhaps because their life was more stable now. Their daughter was born in early spring, a tiny thing with Xavier's blue eyes and Natalie's auburn hair. They named her Margaret, after Xavier's mother. Margaret was a quieter baby than Samuel had been, more content to observe the world than to demand its attention. Samuel was fascinated by his little sister, constantly wanting to help care for her, to show her his treasures, to include her in his play even though she was far too young. "You are going to be a wonderful big brother," Natalie told him one evening as he carefully held Margaret under close supervision. "I will protect her," Samuel said seriously. "Like Papa protects us." Xavier, listening from the doorway, felt emotion tighten his throat. His son understood, even at 4 years old, what family meant, what responsibility and love looked like. Life was not always easy. There were years when the crops failed and money was tight. There were illnesses that swept through the community, terrifying days when one of the children ran a high fever, and Xavier and Natalie took turns sitting up through the night, praying for recovery. There were arguments and misunderstandings, moments when the stress of life threatened to pull them apart. But through it all, they held onto each other. They remembered where they had started, 2 lonely people who had found each other in the worst of circumstances and had chosen to build something beautiful from that beginning. When Samuel was 10 and Margaret was 6, they took a family trip to Reno. Xavier had resisted going back, not wanting to revisit the place where he had met Natalie under such terrible circumstances. But Natalie insisted that she needed to face it, to show herself how far she had come. They stayed at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, which was still operating though Mrs. Chen herself was now quite elderly. The older woman wept when she saw them, delighted to meet the children and to see how well Xavier and Natalie had built their life together. "I knew you would make it," Mrs. Chen said, holding Natalie's hands. "That first night when you came to my door, I saw survivors. I knew you would not just endure but thrive." On their last day in Reno, Xavier took Natalie to the spot where the auction platform had once stood. It was gone now, torn down years ago, replaced by a respectable storefront. "This is where you saved me," Natalie said quietly, holding Xavier's hand while their children played nearby. "This is where we saved each other," Xavier corrected. Natalie smiled at him, that same smile that had captured his heart years ago. "You are right. Neither of us could have made it alone. But together, look what we built." They returned to Silver Creek with stories and presents for the community that had become their extended family. Xavier had never imagined he could be content in one place, surrounded by people, tied down by responsibilities. But he had learned that roots were not the same as chains, that community could coexist with independence, that love did not diminish a person but expanded them. As the children grew, Xavier and Natalie made sure they understood their family's story. They did not hide the difficult beginning, the circumstances that had brought their parents together. Samuel and Margaret knew that their mother had overcome tremendous hardship, that their father had chosen compassion over indifference, that their family had been forged in adversity. "Why did you buy Mama?" Margaret asked one evening when she was 8, old enough to understand but young enough to be blunt. Xavier looked at Natalie, who nodded for him to answer. "Because I could not stand by and watch someone hurt her," he said honestly. "Because I saw that she was strong and brave, and I wanted to give her a chance to show the world what I could see." "Were you scared?" Margaret asked her mother. "Terrified," Natalie admitted. "I did not know your father. I did not know if I could trust him. But he showed me through his actions that he was worthy of trust, and I chose to take a chance on him the same way he took a chance on me. That is what love is, Samuel said thoughtfully, taking chances on people. Xavier smiled at his son. That is part of it, yes. But it is also choosing to stay, even when things get hard. It is working together to solve problems. It is believing in each other. The years continued to unfold. Samuel grew into a young man interested in law and justice, determined to use his education to help people who found themselves in situations like his mother had faced. Margaret developed a passion for teaching, spending hours helping her mother in the schoolhouse, already planning her own career as an educator. Xavier and Natalie watched their children grow with a mixture of pride and poignancy. The house that had once been too small for all their noise and energy began to feel spacious as Samuel left for university in San Francisco, and Margaret spent more time with her own friends and pursuits. "We are getting old," Natalie said one evening as they sat on their porch, watching the sun set over the Sierra Nevada mountains. "We are getting older," Xavier corrected, pulling her close. "But I would not trade a single gray hair if it means having lived this life with you. Even the hard parts, especially the hard parts, they are what taught us who we are, what we are capable of together." When Xavier was 54 and Natalie 46, Samuel married a young woman he had met at university. She was a lawyer like him, passionate about justice and reform. The wedding was held in Silver Creek, with the entire community in attendance. Xavier walked down the aisle with his son, remembering his own wedding in this same church, thinking about the passage of time and the cycles of life. 3 years later, Margaret married a teacher from Carson City, a kind young man who loved books and children as much as she did. Her wedding was smaller, more intimate, but no less joyful. Xavier danced with both his daughter and his wife, feeling grateful for every moment that had led to this one. The grandchildren arrived in time, Samuel's son first, then Margaret's daughter, then more over the years until Xavier and Natalie had 6 grandchildren spread between their 2 children. The small house in Silver Creek became a gathering place for family, filled with noise and laughter, and the chaos of multiple generations. Natalie retired from teaching when she was 60, after more than 30 years in the classroom. The community threw her a celebration that lasted 3 days, with former students traveling from across the West to honor the woman who had shaped their education and their lives. Xavier gradually reduced his work as well, though he never fully retired. He still took pleasure in being outdoors, in reading the land, in passing his knowledge to his grandchildren, who would sit with rapt attention as he taught them to track animals and identify plants. They were sitting on their porch on a summer evening, Xavier 72 and Natalie 64, when she turned to him with a soft smile. "You remember what I said to you? Those first words in the boarding house." Xavier did not need to think about it. He had carried those words with him every day for more than 40 years. "You said, 'I am not what you think I am.' And you said you never thought I was broken. You were not. You never were." Natalie leaned her head on his shoulder, fitting against him as perfectly as she had that first night in Silver Creek. "You were right. I was not broken, but I was lost, and you helped me find my way." "We found our way together," Xavier said, kissing the top of her head. "We are still finding it, every day." They sat in comfortable silence as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky. Inside the house, they could hear their granddaughter practicing piano, the notes drifting out through the open windows. In the barn, their grandson was probably trying to convince one of the horses to let him ride bareback, despite being told repeatedly that he was too young. This was their life, not perfect, not without struggles, but rich with love and meaning. They had built it together, brick by brick, choice by choice, from the darkest of beginnings into something that would outlast them both. Xavier thought about that day in Reno, about the young man he had been, lonely and isolated, convinced that solitude was the answer to the pain of living. He had been so wrong. Connection was the answer. Love was the answer. Choosing to care about another person, to invest in their well-being, to build a life together, that was what gave existence meaning. "Thank you," he said quietly. Natalie lifted her head to look at him. "For what?" "For saying yes. For taking a chance on a lonely trapper who did not know how to be part of a family. For building this life with me. For everything." Natalie's eyes, still that remarkable shade of green even after all these years, filled with tears. "I should be thanking you. You gave me my freedom, then you loved me enough to let me choose to share it with you. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me." They kissed, soft and sweet, a gesture repeated thousands of times over decades, but still meaningful, still tender. The grandchildren called for them from inside, wanting them to referee some dispute or share some discovery. Xavier and Natalie stood, hands clasped, and walked back into the warmth and light of their home. The years ahead would bring new joys and new sorrows. There would be more grandchildren, then great-grandchildren. There would be losses, friends and community members passing, health challenges to navigate, the inevitable march of time. But through it all, Xavier and Natalie would face everything together, their love deepening with each passing year, their commitment to each other unwavering. They had started as two people alone in the world, brought together by chance or fate in a snowstorm in Reno, Nevada. They had built a family, a home, a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. Their story would be told to grandchildren and great-grandchildren, a tale of darkness transformed into light, of loneliness overcome by love, of two people who chose each other and never stopped choosing each other every day for the rest of their lives. And when Xavier was 89 and Natalie 81, they sat once more on that same porch, in the rocking chairs their children had bought them for their 50th anniversary. Their hands were wrinkled and spotted with age, their bodies weakened by time, but their love was as strong as it had ever been. "You have any regrets?" Natalie asked, her voice softer now, worn by years of teaching and talking and laughing. Xavier thought about it seriously, as he always did when she asked him questions. "I regret that I waited so long to find you," he said. "I regret the years I wasted in isolation, but I do not regret a single moment after I saw you on that platform. Not even the arguments, the hard times. Especially not those. They taught us how to be strong together. They showed us what we were capable of." Natalie nodded, satisfied with this answer. "I regret nothing," she said firmly. "Every difficult moment led me to you, led me to this life. I would not change any of it." They sat in silence, holding hands, watching their great-grandson play in the yard with his dog. The sun was setting again, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and gold. Somewhere in the distance, they could hear the dinner bell ringing at one of the neighboring farms. "I love you," Xavier said, as he had said countless times over the decades. "I love you too," Natalie replied, as she always did. And in that moment, in that house, in that community they had helped build, surrounded by the evidence of their life together, Xavier Oakley and Natalie Kensington Oakley were completely, utterly, perfectly content. They had found what so many people search for their entire lives, a love that endured, a partnership that strengthened them both, a family that would carry their legacy forward. From the darkest winter day, they had built a spring that lasted decades, a summer of love and growth, and now an autumn of satisfaction and peace. And when the final winter came, as it eventually must for everyone, they would face it together, as they had faced everything else. Their story, which began with a desperate woman on an auction block and a lonely cowboy who could not walk away, had become something beautiful, a testament to the transformative power of love, the resilience of the human spirit, and the truth that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures. And they lived, truly and fully lived, happily ever after.